Hi everybody and welcome to this video. My name is Yannis, I'm a musician and producer, and in this video I want to show you how you can create some very pleasant and warm bass sound by using Ableton's Analog device. So first of all, you need to load the Analog device. So you can find it under Instruments and just double click and it will just create a new MIDI track. I can delete this one now. And here we have our Analog. I'm just going to make this smaller again. And if we play now, we hear some sound. And the first thing we want to do is to deactivate Oscillator 2, because we want to focus on making some really nice sound for one oscillator first that also works by itself before actually adding up an additional oscillator. Then in Analog you always have various settings depending on which section you're on. You can see that this middle part changes, and if you click on this right part you can change the amount of voices or the polyphony, so the amount of notes that can be played at the same time. And this one we're going to change to mono, because for bass sounds it's always the most pleasant if we only hear one note at a time and don't have some weird overlapping of different tones. The next important step is to adjust the filter frequency, because now the filter is really open and that's why the sound is so bright. But we want to bring this down to maybe around 150. You can also type it in, but somehow I'm never doing it. And also add some resonance, because it brightens the sound in a pleasant way, because now we have some kind of cool bass sound already. I'm going to make this a little louder now. And if you add some resonance, you just make it sing a little more. I usually add about 20. Of course, that's up to taste. You can also just not use any resonance, but I also like to add a little bit. You can also choose different types of filters, like the low pass 24 is steeper, like more radical than, for example, the low pass 12. And for bass sounds, I often like the low pass 24 filters. I'm just going to keep it, because if I would change to the 12 one, you see more of this kind of high fuzzy stuff gets through, because it isn't so radical. But this one has some nice tight sound that I just enjoy for bass. Then for enhancing this Analog vibe, I'm gonna add some vibrato, because it makes the sound a little wobblier. If you do it too much, it's kind of goofy. But if you have it like around 50% at some rate, I always pick like 5 or 6, like somewhere in there. And you can see now that the velocity is kind of all over the place, because some notes are really loud, and that's why the velocity is reacting too much on my amount of how much I press the keys. I like some velocity, but not this much. And if you click on amp, you can see here envelope velocity, and that's the thing that you want to bring down. If I bring it to 0, I can play super soft and super hard, and it has exactly the same velocity. And usually I just like to add a little bit, because for bass it's also nice to have it tight, but to have a tiny bit of movement is actually fine. Actually, let's take 2. Somewhere around this area usually works fine, but just do this however you want. If you don't want any velocity, that's also totally fine. And now let's adjust our filter envelope a little more, because actually the decay is kind of pleasant. You can see here, if I make it very short, you get those plucks. But I usually like it a little more open, like around, let's say 750-ish, or 17. And then you can play with the sustain, because if you bring it up all the way, it just stays as open as in the beginning. If you bring it all the way down, you have this kind of strong attack and then it kind of sweeps out, which is also really pleasant. And I usually like to have it at maybe around 25%, because this way I still keep a little bit of this filter sound. And if you play with the decay, you can also make this whole curve of the sound or the filter actually closing again longer, which sometimes can be pleasant. I'm going to bring it back down to 0.50 though, almost. And there we actually have our basic sound. And one more thing you want to watch out for is the amplitude envelope. And this comes after the filter, so it again modulates the filter, so you can make settings of the filter actually useless by having the wrong amplitude settings. And if I now also bring down the decay, we can just only end up with this kind of short noise, and all the nice settings we have for the filter are just gone. So just make sure the decay is long enough, because the other things are actually made by the filter anyway, and that you have the amount of sustain that you like. You can also just make it max, but usually 0.5 is fine. But just use those to fine-tune your sound and to get it to the point where you like the sustain the most. Another nice thing about the filter section is that here under Drive you can actually select different stages of saturation, and like I'm just gonna pick symmetrical 3, and the sound gets a little louder for sure, but also a bit more charismatic, and also something I just like to use. And one more thing for dynamic purposes, like I've shown you where you can change the velocity of the amplitude, and you can also have some velocity applications to the filter, for example, because if you increase the amount of key tracking, it means that the higher you go in register, like the higher notes you play, the more the filter opens, which can be kind of cool sometimes. So here you see the C now is super low. And here it's really open. But this is some very obvious setting. You usually just want to have it to some very small amount, that you can hear it change over like 1 or 2 octaves in subtle changes, but not as extreme as I've shown you. And I haven't mentioned it so far, but we were using a sawtooth wave because this type of shape is really the best one for this analog, warm type of bass sound. So if you want to make it sound a little bigger, you can now try to add the second oscillator. And before we do that, let's click again on this menu to our right. And here you have some quick routing where you can just tell the synthesizer on how to process the sound. And we're going to pick this one here because it makes sure that after those 2 oscillators are generated, they're going to be sent through the same filter, which is the most classic setting, but also the most easy to use. And this way we can just control the overall sound a little better, and it's going to be a bit smoother. So now let's activate Oscillator 2. And before we play any note, let's put it 1 octave down, because this is something that makes bass sounds really massive. If you have like some almost sub-octave, but then also this kind of warm sound we've just created. And we also want to detune it a bit, like around 0.11, for example. And now we have to check. And there you can see already what happened. It's way bigger, but now the movement sounds a little weird. And with this type of open massive bass, it often sounds nice to make the decay a little longer of the filter. And now again we have to apply this to the amp as well, so this doesn't interfere. Better already, but we're also going to bring up the sustain, because if you have this kind of massive bass sound, it sounds really nice to actually hear this filter movement. Maybe we want to pick some other type of saturation because it's happening a lot right now. I'm gonna pick number 2. And then of course you can modify it to your taste, adjust the envelopes the way you want to. This is just like the starting point for building those nice analog bass sounds. You can also then add just some chorus or saturation, whatever you want to. But this is then up to you. This is just about the bases. And what I also like about this one is if you click on Oscillator 2, you can here change between either a sub or a sync setting. And I like to play with the sync setting because I can't explain it that well, to be honest, but it's some sort of sync between those oscillators. And then with the ratio, you can actually hear, if I play now, there's some interplay, and actually around 20% again, there's some singing tone that I enjoy. Sometimes it can make some problematic overtones. But I find it kind of pleasant, and the same goes for the unison detune, which basically detunes your overall sound and creates some additional voices. This can sound really massive, but also needs to be happening at a spot where it fits, but it can be kind of fun to play with it. And you can also make it sound extremely detuned. Also super dark. And usually also around this amount you have it in the more subtle way, but again up to taste, and I like the sound a lot without it actually. Some very nice bass sound you can work with. And that's it already. I hope you'll have some fun playing around with bass sounds in Ableton and can come up with some very great sounds yourself. Thanks a lot for watching. If you liked it, you're warmly invited to subscribe to this channel. And apart from that, I just wish you tons of inspiration with your music that you create and hope to see you some other time soon. Bye.